The heat never even woke me up. I lay there as the sun's rays crept through the window and slowly poured themselves over me. When I eventually woke up, I knew right away I was late for class. You just get this feeling in your gut when something is wrong, don't you? My wife was the one who always set the alarm for me in the morning. It slipped my mind before bed every now and again now that I'm sleeping alone. When I'm late, it means my daughters are late because I'm their alarm clock. I've asked them countless times to set their own alarms, but they don't listen. When the systems fail at my end, it fails at theirs too. I shake them, hollering and hooting until they're up and ready to go. Scowls appear on their little faces when I tell them there's no time for breakfast. Just get in the car and they can get something quick at morning interval. I kiss them, Abby, the eldest, on the forehead and Lucy, the youngest, on the cheek when I drop them off at school. Abby's face contorts in fox horror as she rubs at the impact zone while Lucy smiles a bright, "I love you, Daddy," at me. I then drive a few miles to my school, find a space to park, and hurry through the front doors. I'm almost running when I pass John. He gives me a disapproving shake of the head, then looks at his watch to confirm my lateness, the fourth time this month. His sympathy for my situation has limits, and I'm certainly pushing them. Then the morning rush is finally over, and I stood in front of 30 pairs of expectant eyes with a hangover like a dead man's switch, threatening to explode if I let it. "Good morning, class." "Good morning, Mr. Smith," in unison. I dread Mondays the most because it's feedback day and I need to look her in the eye and ask her about another disturbing story. The creative writing assignments are due on Fridays, and that's when she'll place it meekly on my desk. I shudder a little when I see that neat, looping handwriting of hers. It's the only class I dread the entire week, and it's just my luck it falls first thing on a Monday. These kids are 12 or 13, so most of the stories are just shitty rip-offs of whatever the latest movie is. A simile written or adjective fest. Sophie's were always the same though. I asked her to try writing in other styles, and she'd always smile and say she would, and then I'd get the next chapter of her story on the Friday. Cordelia or Ophelia are two princesses who live in a decrepit castle in a far-off land. They spend their day stealing fruits and meats from the town's marketplace, despite being the daughters of a king. In the first story I read about the princesses' daring exploits, they had been caught trying to steal from the mean old fishmonger, but he let them go in a panic after he realized she was a king's daughter. I gave Sophie an A on it. It was refreshing to read, something with a little imagination for once. The next Friday, however, the story took a darker turn. I was introduced to the Obsidian Man. The Obsidian Man is never described in detail. He's just this presence in her stories that only Cordelia can see. Sophie would interject him into scenes without much thought, like the story where Cordelia had to find medicine in the town for Ophelia. The Obsidian Man is standing by Ophelia's bed when Cordelia leaves, and she sees him in the forest. "Who is this character?" I asked her. She just shrugged as she hadn't thought much about it. "What does he do? I mean, surely you didn't just put in a character like him without a point. He's just always there. I don't know." I received out of the 3 or 4 stories like this. The two sisters would be off on an adventure while the king was away. The Obsidian Man would always be close by and not really interfering. Then I received the story. The Obsidian Man steps forward. The Obsidian Man starts whispering to Princess Cordelia in the night. She tries to ignore him at first, but describes how she can't sleep with his voice in her head. A voice that's so low in tone that she can feel it in her stomach. I don't want to listen, but I have to. It must belong to a god. Cordelia says. And that's when I started noticing Sophie's paling face and darkening eyes. She wouldn't say much in class, and when she did, she usually burst into fits of tears. Her hair grew unkempt and her uniform untidier as the days went by. Eventually I had to say something, so I told John, who in turn contacted her father. John and I sat down with the guy one Friday afternoon in my class, and he'd agreed to meet with us. I told him of my concerns that Sophie may be writing these stories to express some troubles that she was suffering. Mr. Sterling told us that Sophie and her little sister had become more and more reclusive since his wife and him had separated. He told us that he had been worrying himself, but with 2 kids and 2 jobs, he just didn't have much time to talk to her. John suggested that Mr. Sterling was the king, Sophie was Cordelia, and her sister Ophelia and the Obsidian Man was a metaphor for the parents' divorce. A looming presence that Sophie couldn't stop thinking about it. He told me to try and encourage Sophie to keep writing about it, and it could be a form of meditation for her. Mr. Sterling seemed happy enough with that, but I wasn't convinced. I think the parallels between Mr. Sterling's situation and my own worried me the most. He was just a guy trying to do the best for his family. It's just unsettling, Mr. Sterling. She refuses to write anything but these stories, I said, passing him copies. Sophie would never steal. He almost shouted when I pointed out the stories where the Obsidian Man had convinced her to go to the marketplace and take whatever she wanted. The stories got darker and darker as the weeks went on, and started to notice a reoccurring theme in them. The king was never around. He'd always be off fighting battles or getting drunk at these grand feasts. The Obsidian Man would make Cordelia do awful things to her sister. He'd whisper in her ear until she just had to obey him to make him stop. Then she'd force her sister to drink soured milk until she was sick. She'd prod her legs with tacks and hold her head under the bathwater until she came back sputtering and crying. Cordelia wanted to stop, but she couldn't. It was as if the Obsidian Man was her puppeteer. The king never suspected a thing. The story would always end with the Obsidian Man asking Cordelia to make him a gift to show her love for him. She'd make jewelry from old bottles and paper while he watched down from behind, his dark presence always felt and never seen. I became gravely concerned for Sophie's little sister Monica. She was in the year below her, but not in my English class. I informed John of these new developments and to make sure that there is no truth in them. John contacted the king, who told us that he hadn't noticed anything going on between his girls, which really didn't surprise me. Reading Sophie's stories were gut-wrenching for me. I'd sit down on a Friday night with a stack of stories and find myself holding my breath as I read over hers, waiting for the horror. The Obsidian Man became like an ever-present in my life too. One Friday in October last year, I received Sophie's last story. It was titled, The Obsidian Man Steps Back. When I read it, I got a little excited that it may be the story of how Sophie finally overcame her fears. But how wrong I was. Cordelia had started to sneak jugs of oil, which she'd stolen from the townspeople, into the castle at the Obsidian Man's request. The king hadn't noticed because he was preoccupied with an ongoing war. She had hidden the jugs in the dungeons below the castle, and one day when the king went out on a raiding party, the Obsidian Man told her to douse the castle in it. Pour extra into Ophelia's room, around the doors and windows too. We must cleanse this place. You are such a good girl. Sophie wrote of the Obsidian Man's metallic voice. The story ends with Cordelia standing outside the castle with a flaming torch in her hand. There's a line of flammable oil leading to the castle, just begging to be lit. The Obsidian Man put a hand on her shoulder. It's icy cold and grips tightly. It's the first time she's touched her. She feels terrified, but inexplicably reassured that she's doing the right thing. He leans in to whisper, and she feels the cold breath on her neck. I dropped the paper onto the floor. I couldn't read anymore. I phoned John to tell him what I'd read, and he told me that he'd have a chat with Sophie first thing Monday morning. After I hung up, I poured myself a big, satisfying glass of whiskey. I really needed a drink after one of Sophie's stories. The next morning I woke up in the same chair in my living room, the buzzing of my phone rising me from the stupor. John spoke wordly on the other end. He said people in the town centers had complained that their cars had been siphoned of gas during the night. Some people claiming to have seen a young girl with canisters. The police had summoned the headmasters of all the local schools to try and identify the girl on the tapes, and I just knew it was Sophie. "They're blurry as hell," he whispered to me. "I think you should get down here." I don't know if it was my empathy for Mr. Sterling or my concern for Sophie, and instead of going to the police station, I headed over to their house. Mr. Sterling answered the door, and I explained the situation to him. He denied Sophie had anything to do with it at first, but eventually he admitted he was working night shift that previous night and he couldn't account for her. That's when she appeared in the doorway, a look of horror on her face, sufficient for a young girl who'd walked into her living room on a Saturday morning, only to see her English teacher there. I asked her about the cars, but she denied it. Softly at first, but the harder I pressed, she became more and more aggressive. "You're not in trouble, sweetheart. We just want to help." "I'm trying. I don't know. Her head snapped up towards. "Go home. Leave. Just go home." She screamed, her eyes rolling back in her skull as her voice contorted. The girl began pounding the wall with her fists, her legs flailing and teeth gnawing. Mr. Sterling pounced to his feet quickly and grabbed his little girl as she had what looked like a seizure on the floor. "He's here. He's in the room. I can hear him whispering. Don't listen to him, Cordelia." "Quick, hand me that syringe," he barked at me firmly but calmly. I complied and watched as he injected Sophie's arm with a clear-looking medicine. The ease with which he'd done it made me think that this kind of thing was a regular occurrence in that house. Sophie's mouth began to foam as she shook violently one last time before her muscles finally relaxed. My heart wrenched as she came to and began sobbing in her father's arms. He gripped her tightly with a stoic look, welded onto his face. "I think you should leave now," he said to me. "But what the hell was that? Please, leave us alone." I could feel my hands shaking as I walked home. I had not been prepared for that. My feet seemed to respond by directing me to my local corner shop where a bottle of calm-me-down juice was calling my name. "You okay, Mr. Smith?" Andy said from behind the counter as I walked to the door. My face must have been visibly white. Yeah," I mumbled as I took my wallet out of my pocket. I pulled a couple of packets of M&Ms silently from the shelf and tossed them on the counter as Andy placed my usual bottle in front of me. "Look," he said, leaning in closer. I wasn't going to say anything, but is everything okay with you? "What do you mean?" I asked, puzzled. He poked his head forward to make sure no one else was in the store. "I caught Abby shoplifting here last week. Now, I know we go way back, but, you know." "My Abby?" "Yeah, she sneaked a packet of fish fingers in her backpack when she thought I couldn't see. Most kids try lifting sweets or booze, you know. I'm not taking it any further. I just thought that you should know." The fishmonger grabbed poor Cordelia by her long coat. She yelped in pain as she turned towards the angry man. He released her as soon as she recognized the princess's face. His heart sank as he realized he had just violently grabbed the king's eldest daughter. Sophie had written, "I never ran as fast as I did getting home, and I doubt I'll ever run faster again." By the time I reached the house, flames reached out every window, the roof collapsing as I stood there, numb. Plumes of smoke and fiery blasts erupted from the window of Lucy's room, the fire seemingly fiercer there, and I could smell that awful burning. Abby sat in the back garden, kicking her feet and humming as she made daisy chains. A line of scorched grass led from her to the back door. She didn't seem to notice the blaze as she tied knots in the flowers. I sat down beside her and watched on helplessly as the roof came down upon my world. I felt the heat from the inferno on my face, and I wondered if it was all a dream or if the heat would wake me up. Abby sat there after she'd finished making her chains. She tied one around her wrist and held the other in her right hand. "Is that for me?" I asked from behind a numb throat, pointing to her hand. "No," she said.